Without much further ado, I give you the Derek Zoolander Center for Kids Who Can't Read Good.
What is this?
A center for ants? What?
How can we be expected to teach children to learn how to read if they can't even fit inside the building?
Hey everybody, Marcus here. So the last watch-along video went over quite well, so I'm going to do another one of these commentary videos. This one pertains to the subject of why apparently the student body has stopped reading or can't read. And this is a complaint that's apparently being raised in universities by professors, and there's definitely going to be some merit to the observations that are presented in this video. However, I do have some of my own commentary based on my own life experience and my relationship to reading, which was very rocky at the start, and it only really picked up approaching my 30s, which there's commentary I can make related to how Plato saw education, and I think it's somewhat pertinent to what the gentleman in this video is going to be presenting. So let's get started.
At universities all around the country, professors are reporting a problem. Students can't read books. This is true even at elite colleges and universities. In one required class at Columbia, students are often expected to read about a book a week.
How dense is this book? Is the first question, as in conceptually dense, because a book is not equivalent to a book. I mean, reading Heidegger, even say 100 pages, is going to be a very different experience from reading a Goosebumps book. And the second thing is, what is the page count of these books? That's also quite pertinent. And finally, which isn't brought up, I don't think, in this video at all, is that if you're studying, say, an English major, you have 5, say, subjects per semester. Is it the case that each of those 5 professors is requesting that the student read a book for each course independently in a week? Because that would be quite excessive.
But in the past couple of years, students have started telling their professors that they can't do it. One student told her professor that she had never been required to read an entire book. This is part of a larger trend. People aren't reading anymore. This is true for men and women, people who went to college and people who didn't. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that there are many pieces to this puzzle, but it all begins with how we teach kids to read. For a very long time, we taught kids to read in a very particular way. We called it phonics. With phonics, you start with individual sounds. You work your way up from those sounds into more complex sounds, and then you see how those sounds build words. If you come across an unfamiliar word, you're told to sound it out. But starting around the 1960s, a new approach to language education emerged, and we called this whole language learning. In whole language learning and some successor ideas like balanced literacy, the idea was that you should learn to read at the level of a word, using a method called 3-cueing.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure that this is uniform across all countries here. Phonics in Poland still is being taught, I think, even to this day. Maybe there's some innovation in it. Maybe in the US, what this guy's talking about is the case. However, if you look at language learning software like Rosetta Stone, for example, it still uses the phonics approach. In fact, the premise behind Rosetta Stone as a language learning tool is that it does not attempt to translate between languages. What it does, it assumes that the natural mechanisms the human being possesses of acquiring language, the way that they acquire language, their first language specifically as a youth, is not through translating one word to another word, like, I don't know, the English word apple to jabłko in Polish. It's not how you do it. I mean, a lot of adults do it this way, that they translate words in their head, but that the way you do it is people point to objects and then make the sound of the word that represents the object that they're pointing to. And through association, you come to learn the names of objects within the material world. And Rosetta Stone as a piece of software does exactly this. The lesson plan there presents you with a series of images with someone speaking natively in the tongue you're attempting to acquire. And through simply observation of the images and the words that are being spoken on top of it, you start to pick up what it is that the speaker is intending to say. So, so this phonics approach, I don't think is so dead as is being presented here in an absolute sense. I know in mathematics as well, there's been a radical shift away from traditional methods of teaching, like the multiplications table, for example, has been completely stripped out of the curriculum and replaced with some weird system that I don't really know the details of how it functions. I know that my sister's kids showed me once how multiplication was taught, and it was quite alien from what I used to know when they were teaching us in school. However, there was merit in the new system in that when I did observe my nephew show me the process, it was reminiscent of how I transformed what I was taught in school to then map on my own thinking of how to do multiplications in my head for a more complex series of numbers, as opposed to, 1 times 10 being 10, 9 times 9 being 81. There's methods of multiplying, say, 147 by 53, which you're not going to be able to do in your head as easily. But this new method that was presented to me by my nephew did actually allow for those more complicated strings of multiplication to occur in your head. But that was an advanced technique. That was not something that I think was appropriate at all for teaching somebody the concept of multiplication. So these new methods of teaching in school might make sense if you're referring to adult learners who are a little bit more advanced, but probably they don't work for kids.
Students were taught to infer the meaning of words from context. This whole approach was pitched as a very natural, almost kind of organic way to teach kids how to read. The idea was that actually that kids had a natural propensity to read, and that all you needed to do was put them in the right context and maybe give them a few small techniques or nudges, and they would basically teach themselves how to read. You wouldn't.
But kids do teach themselves how to read. I mean, ultimately, someone can't teach you how to read. All they can do is show you structures of words, how they're constructed from the letters themselves, the sounds that they make, and then ultimately you have to practice the activity. It's kind of like learning how to ride a bike. Nobody can teach you how to ride a bike. They can just demonstrate the mechanics of riding a bicycle, and through repetition and attempts of your own to, get on that thing and use your legs and use your arms to keep balance, and then eventually sense internally in your body that mechanism of balancing on the bicycle to teach yourself to ride it. So it's the same thing with reading. I mean, all the teacher can actually do is, I guess, show you the process, and then through the application of practice, you educate yourself. So what he's describing right now seems to be somewhat, I don't know, it's contravening a little bit of what came prior here. Phonics makes sense to teach the sounds, but then ultimately the method of learning, of association, is something that Rosetta Stone practices, which actually does work. I'm kind of confused how this could be a handicap exactly.
Have to go through a kind of boring process like learning phonics. It's actually kind of a romantic idea, right? It'd be lovely if kids just had this natural ability to read as long as we just put them in the right environment. And it makes reading feel more like an art than a science. The only problem is that whole language learning didn't work. Literacy rates fell, and in the countries which
This doesn't necessarily mean that the methods themselves were deficient. I think a lot of the problems with school is that it's boring. The material that kids are expected to learn has no relatability and no immediately accessible practical use to students. I remember when I was in elementary school, the books were simply unrelatable that we were asked to read. Same thing in high school. And this carried on well into my late 20s, to the extent that I remember when I was in university, I took computer science. Well, the first time. Second time I did philosophy. But the first time I was in uni, I went at 17. And I had no particular interest in reading anything resembling literature or anything for that matter of the arts. It just was of no interest to me. So I took everything related to the hard sciences, and comp sci being within that space, but the courses I was electing for myself were all in that analytical domain, except one. I took a Russian literature course, and we were asked to read a collection of short stories from a variety of authors, Pushkin, Gogol, who else? Well, Dostoevsky. I don't remember. But anyways, the point is that class was a revelation because of the quality of the professor. the professor made intelligible something to me that was a mystery. First of all, the writings we were asked to read were relevant to my life. They were existential in nature. A lot of those Russian authors had that tinge, that kind of Russian pessimism, which was also anchored in a moment of time. The writings he was selecting, like Chekhov, were kind of anchored in a similar period to Dostoevsky, meaning that there was a move in Russian literature towards existential thought. And since existential thought can be translated directly to a person's lived experience, it was interesting. And the professor himself had a very good way of explaining how to read these short stories. And only upon encountering this competent explanation of how to interpret the text did I acquire a palate for reading literature. Before then, I remember in high school being forced to read Old Man and the Sea. I mean, it was a book about a guy who goes fishing and then a shark eats his fish and he was sad. I mean, it was that depressing how little I could infer out of the text. Shakespeare was just complicated language that meant basically nothing to me. And obviously, it had nothing to do with my intelligence. It had everything to do with how the material was really presented to me and the selection of material at the time. So, following this Russian literature course in university, I took another course from him on Russian history, and that was also very well presented. So I remember elements of it, of the history course itself, but I paid more attention to the way he explained how to interpret text, even in the historical context, but also from the Russian theme, more so than I was interested in the dates and events of Russian history itself, though they are quite fascinating. I think we have a problem mostly that kids, it's not that they don't want to learn to read, it's not that they don't like reading or cannot read, it's more that the material is just garbage, and the teachers themselves are just garbage themselves in presenting the material.
Which had adopted whole language learning, that would be parts of the United States, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, more and more kids weren't able to read at grade level. It was a systemic failure of education systems across multiple countries. And if we're trying to explain why people don't read anymore, well, this has to be part of the story. If you weren't taught how to read properly, reading is never going to be something that you do for fun. It's never going to be pleasurable. It's going to feel really difficult and like a lot of work. And so if more and more people find reading difficult, then they're just going to stop reading. Now, whole language learning and balanced literacy, these were never uncontested ideas. Despite the fact that they were adopted in so many countries, there were always people who were pushing back. And this was something that became known as the reading wars. In some states, it was described as the most vicious debate in politics. Journalists and scientists have been reporting on the damaging effects of whole language learning, and actually,
Yeah, I'm still of the opinion here that we're missing the forest for the trees here. I mean, people are arguing about the methods of teaching, and they're not looking at the substantive content that they are teaching itself. And when a subject is interesting, you will suffer through great pains in order to go through the material. Reading philosophy is not easy, specifically when you get started. I mean, there's certain writers that are far easier to begin with than others, like Plato, for example. Plato is easy to read comparatively to somebody like Heidegger, because Plato wrote in a time where there was no complex philosophical jargon. There were no isms really established at those times. There was no foundationalism, coherentism, existentialism, all these ism words that were labels constructed far later in the long debate of philosophical discourse to act as short forms to be able to quickly reference moments in history and thought. So when you're reading Plato, you're not encountering any of these ism words. You're talking about horse breeders and doctors and farmers and, cooks and politicians and poets, things that everybody grasps just by existing in the real world. So in that sense, reading Plato is really, really easy. Plus, Plato was a poet. So the text itself was pretty. It was just fun to read because it sounded good as sound, and the content was interesting, and it was relatable because it talked about things that, well, you could relate to, that you didn't need a complex background to understand. And then you get into somebody like Heidegger. And Heidegger, being a 20th century philosopher, uses a very complex set of words, also obviously uses all the isms in his writings, but he invents his own language. He invents words to wrap up around the complex concepts that he presents. And in order to dissect the work of Heidegger, first you got to learn Heideggerian, which is basically his series of made-up words, and there are Heidegger dictionaries. Like Dasein, the word Dasein is not a real word. It's a Heideggerian word, and you have to learn these definitions. So in order to consume a piece by Heidegger, even something like his essay concerning technology, which is like 30, 40 pages, that'll take you a week itself to fully digest if you're reading it for the first time. And you have to have a strong interest in the subject matter to suffer through that process. It's the same thing with reading Nietzsche. Nietzsche uses a lot of poetic flowery language that you need to adopt before you can get at the substantive meaning of the work. So unless you're interested in the subject to begin with, you will not suffer through the content. So if they're having kids read things that have nothing to do with anything that they could relate to, they will not endure the labor to understand the text. It will seem like a waste of time. It'll be immensely demotivating. And my problem with how this argument is being presented right now in this video is that it's a focus on the methods of teaching, meaning the replacement of phonics with whatever that whole meaning mechanism that they're putting into place, as opposed to focusing on the substantive content itself. Because people do read when they're interested, and they will make it work.
We might be able to say that COVID-19 is going to lead to a change in how kids learn to read. Because during the pandemic, when more kids were learning at home, their parents got to see how ineffective whole language learning really was, and that added a lot of political will to solving the problem. More and more states and even countries are bringing back phonics into their reading programs. And while some of the insights from whole language learning might stay in the classroom, at least kids are going to be learning those basic building blocks, which the data do seem to indicate actually would help them. So maybe we'll see a turn in the future where more people want to read for pleasure again. For the students who were never taught phonics, though, much of the damage is already done, and I don't know how to fix.
That's the thing. The notion of reading for pleasure requires an association that reading can be pleasurable, and it is when you're reading something that is interesting. And it's very painful, even if you're a competent reader, to read something that is not interesting. That seems just like a waste of time. So if these kids aren't reading for pleasure, they've never associated reading as pleasurable, meaning that the things they were forced to read were never interesting to them.
Fix that problem. Now, this is speculation, but I would be willing to bet that kids who make it into a school like Columbia or other elite universities are probably able to read at grade level, but they were still telling their professors that they didn't feel capable of reading a book in even a week. And these are kids, remember, who are mostly full-time students. They have a lot of free time, and actually their studies should be their main focus. So just pointing out sort of the disastrous effects of whole language learning isn't going to adequately explain why fewer people are reading. But part of the explanation does still seem to come from the way that these kids were taught in school. And it has to do with education reforms, most infamously things like No Child Left Behind and Common Core.
And that's the thing about those educational programs. I have this hypothesis I've been brewing in my mind around education. I find that school itself as a structure is not really for the benefit of the kids ultimately when you look at how things are structured. It's a place where parents can offload their kids for a substantial amount of time every day. And that is of benefit to them because the parents take no interest in what exactly goes on in those schools beyond the point that the kid comes back with the proper letter on a piece of paper and the proper mathematical symbol. Namely, that letter better be an A, that symbol better be a plus. And beyond that, the parent takes no interest whatsoever in what the kid is being taught. The concern is mostly that the kid is, quote unquote, getting an education, which all it means to a parent is that that kid is being sent to a specific building every day, and some magic apparently goes on there that manifests in an educated child. That's as far as most parents concern themselves with the, quote unquote, education of their children. From the perspective of the teacher, it's a place that you go. The school is a place that you go to earn a salary. And when the incentive programs are set up, like in No Kid Left Behind, where monetary gains for the institution, for the school itself, is associated with test passing, then the school is incentivized not to, quote unquote, educate the student body, but it's set up to Educate the student body on how to pass the tests, because all that's relevant to the school is that a majority of the students themselves achieve good grades, which is the same incentive of the parents themselves who take no interest in the actual development of the child, but in the letter grade. And so too, that aligns with the interests of the adults on the faculty who also have little concern of actually educating the student, as long as the student is writing those tests in a way that is continuing the funding to the institution itself. So the adults on either side of the spectrum have the same incentive, which is to make sure that the student is producing A+ worthy documents at the end of the day, regardless of the mechanisms on how those A+ worthy documents are produced, regardless if they're interested in the subject, regardless if what they're actually being taught has any value in the real world, and regardless of whether or not the student is actually growing as a person.
Those are at least are the names for education reforms in the United States. Other countries have different systems. I'm not talking about those here. The push to reform education in the United States emphasized two things: informational text and standardized testing. When students were being taught how to engage with the text, they were learning how to extract information from it. You would even see people say that books were outdated and that we needed to teach kids about the text that they would actually encounter in real life, like articles or web pages. So as an exercise, a student might be presented with an excerpt from a longer text. They would be asked to analyze the argument or talk about what evidence was presented in the text, or even what the thesis statement was. And a lot of this would happen in English classes, where traditionally you would be first exposed to reading longer and more difficult books. So instead of learning things like analyzing symbolism or theme, or being able to practice your close reading of text, you were mostly focused on extracting information from those excerpts. Doing that traditional English stuff like close reading builds something that we could call your reading stamina. And when a student who is fully capable of reading says that they can't read a whole book in a week, it's likely because they haven't had a chance to develop their reading stamina.
Again, it really depends on the book. Even for myself today, having read hundreds of books and having read a fairly wide breadth of styles of books, from really easy to read, simple language, big letters, short page count, sort of fluff books, like Harry Potter, for example. Maybe it's long, but it's very easy to read. To complicated texts like Heidegger, like Nietzsche, and it could be poetry as well. I mean, poetry is very difficult to read because of the flowery language and the need to sit in a dictionary for a good deal of time to even understand what's being said. And then beyond the words themselves, breaking through the symbolism is another task at hand there. This subject matter is a lot more complicated, I think, than the presenter's making out to be. That's all I'm saying.
And in fact, some professors and teachers, even in high schools or middle schools, say that kids' reading stamina has been declining steadily over the years as well. If you're trying to build your reading stamina, one of the things you can do is just read books. Just sit down and...
But it's also not a race. That's what I was meant to say about the reading stamina, is that I take a long time to read a book. I take a long time because I choose to. It takes a while to absorb the meaning inside what is being presented to you. If you're interested in absorbing words, then you can steamroll a book fairly quickly, because all you need to do is get the gist of what's being said. But if you're actually trying to, dive deeper into the semantics behind what is being presented through words to you, you're going to take time. If you're reading something like the Platonic Dialogues, the Cooper translation, for example, it takes me about 2 minutes a page. I mean, I timed myself before. 2 minutes a page. That would be considered very slow reading. There's people that brag about, going through a page within a few seconds. I don't believe for a second that that person has absorbed that significant amount of semantic meaning in that short period of a time. Maybe whatever scanning mechanism they have gives them the Cole's Notes version of whatever that page said, but they are not extracting any meaningful data from that page with such a scan. So reading quickly, I don't see how that's relevant. If you read slow and are getting value out of it, then it makes no difference as opposed to you reading fast. I mean, if you're reading fast and getting the same amount of value out of it as somebody who reads slow and extracts full value, then that's cool. You have a benefit. But I don't think there's this reading stamina, as he describes it, where you just sit and steamroll through content at a faster rate and retain all value. If there were a thing as reading stamina, I would say it's domain specific. It's contextual to the domain you're reading in, meaning that when you first pick up Heidegger, your quote unquote reading stamina is going to be zero because you're always sitting with a dictionary trying to figure out what the hell he's talking about. And after 6 months to a year of reading Heidegger and little but Heidegger, yeah, you can go through his works at a much faster pace. But that's only because you acquired the domain level knowledge in order to read such a book at a quicker pace. So unless these kids don't understand common use words, that appear in most of the writings that you would be presented in say elementary school, unless they don't know concepts like flowers and cars and people and houses and doors, have trouble conceptualizing those ideas, I don't see how, beyond them not having an interest in the material, their reading stamina would be hindered in any capacity.
Try to see how many pages you can get through before you have to go and do something else. But students increasingly aren't actually being given those opportunities in the classroom or even in assignments. In one survey, only 17% of educators said that they were teaching primarily with whole text. So when it comes to those students at elite colleges and universities, or even just colleges and universities in general, who say that they can't read a whole book, I think it has more to do with this than it does with problems with whole language learning. I think this is the better explanation for why students at Columbia or other great universities aren't able to read whole books. These students were able to get into some of the best colleges and universities in the world, but they were never taught how to be great readers. They were taught how to be great test takers. So when these students get
Yeah, that's exactly it. Every incentive is set up to get a letter grade on a test. You're not there to educate yourself. You're there to pass tests, get scholarships, make your parents proud, and make sure that the faculty continue to get funding.
To college and they're asked to read whole books, they can't do it because this is a completely different skill than they've been told that they need to develop in high school. So much of their education has been about optimizing themselves for standardized tests and then eventually to take something like the SAT or the ACT. And if you're just trying to do really well on a standardized test, you need to focus on reading excerpts and being able to answer multiple choice questions, or maybe write a 5-paragraph essay about what you just read. You don't have to focus on analyzing themes in Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dickens. You don't have to worry about reading great books. So then if you have a required freshman class that's about great novels in the
But it's even worse because the point of reading a great work like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, I mean, he's talking Russian literature here, is not to analyze it in that sort of academic fashion. I mean, I don't read Dostoevsky thinking, how am I going to structure an essay? Talking about Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment and his, coming to realize that the murder of said pawnbroker was really a bad idea. I mean, that's nonsense. The point of reading these texts is to invoke an internal transformation of yourself. It's not really even to educate yourself on some collection of facts. Is you let the book change you. It's an experience in of itself, much like, going on a trip to see a new country. You're meant to be transformed somehow, enhanced, bettered by the enterprise. You're not supposed to remember the book per se. You're supposed to... The memory of the book is retained in the transformation, not in your mind as a collection of facts, is what I'm saying. So when the student body is encouraged to interpret reading as a means of collecting tidbits of facts in order then to construct something out of it that's external, like an essay or passing a test, it's the completely wrong disposition towards reading itself. Because when you read as an adult, when there is no pressure on you to talk about the work with anybody, to write anything about it, then the core value of the book itself is for you to transform. It doesn't necessarily mean to change your mind. It just means that you become better. You acquire a broader conceptual framework to entertain your own ideas with. You acquire new words that then you can use to wrap up what you observe outside of your reading exercises and, paint reality in that new language that helps you understand the world more clearly, even in your own mind.
In the Western tradition, well, this might be your first time being exposed to many of those great novels in the Western tradition. And it's going to be hard because you're not used to it. So when we look at the big picture, we have some students who were never taught how to read properly because of things like whole language learning. And then we have students who were never taught how to read books because of an emphasis on standardized testing. But when we want to talk about why other people have stopped reading for fun or just stopped reading in general, there's one more thing we have to talk about, and it's the phones. So something that gets overlooked in a lot of these discussions is that many people actually do spend their days reading. It's just that they're not reading books. If you're scrolling on YouTube or Twitter, then you are actually encountering an endless stream of text. More text than many people throughout history would have encountered in a week or a month. TikTok is maybe the most addictive of these platforms, and practically every video has burned-in captions. So people are constantly reading.
Yeah, that text is not there to encourage you to read it. It's there to create stimulus, a pattern interrupt mechanism. That's why those words are flashing in TikTok videos. They're meant to signal change, which keeps your attention on the video. That's all it's there for.
Reading something when they are online. And if you're driving, you're seeing road signs, you're seeing billboards, you're seeing advertisements. The world wants you to read. It just doesn't really want to give you the time that it takes to read a good book. So this is my backyard, and occasionally I'll come and I'll bring a book and I'll try to get some reading done. It's peaceful and it's quiet, and it's one of the places that I really love. So maybe I start reading the book and I'll feel really good. And then within just a few seconds, this thing wants my attention. So if I want to get any reading done, I have to be disciplined, and I have to decide that my phone needs to stay inside someplace where it.
Or you can just put it on silent mode, which is what people ought to do in general. They ought to default their phones to silent, as in not even vibrating. So it's not something that's commanding your attention, that when you think to see if any activity has happened on the phone, you need to go pick up itself because it's not notifying you of anything. There's this, and this isn't something new here, but this is a phenomenon that's occurred since the invention of the telephone, even stationary phones. I remember back in the 90s, never really thought about it until, smartphones came on the scene and really became this distracting force. But even in the 90s, when people had stationary phones, if they were locked in conversation with a physical person in the room and the phone rang, that conversation would immediately be interrupted. And it was assumed and somehow perceived as proper etiquette for the house owner, who the phone was ringing for, seemingly, would stop all activity with this in real life person to pick up this phone and talk about whatever it is that the person on the other end wanted to talk about. And only once that conversation ended would that homeowner resume their interaction with whoever was in their home. And that's completely backwards, because the in real life person should take priority. So today, people should default, again, like I was saying, to just keeping the phones completely on silent. You go to your phone when you choose to go to your phone. Don't let the phone inform you that it's time to go to it.
Can't distract me. Now imagine that you're a college student and you've never read a full book in a week, or really ever been asked to read a hard or long book for your education. And your professor says, hey, I want you to read Homer's Iliad in a week. Let's say you're a good sport too, and so you go to your...
Yeah, that's not happening. If you're going to get any value out of the Iliad, you're not reading it in a week. It doesn't make any sense. So that's something we can go back to what I said earlier, is like, what kind of book are they asked to read? Because the Iliad requires an enormous amount of background to read properly. You can read the words, but you're getting nothing out of it. It's a waste of time if you're steamrolling through something like the Iliad or the Odyssey.
Your dorm room, you get your book and you say, you know what, I'm going to do it. But now think about all the things that are there ready to distract you. Other people, or your phone, or your laptop. Anything with a screen really is there, and it's ready to just make you feel more stimulated. Because let's face it, even if we're people who really like to read, compared to doing other things, the act of reading is really boring. It is the antithesis of our sort of constant need to be overstimulated. A lot of schools, high schools, middle schools, things like that, have decided to start banning smartphones from the classroom. And my reaction, of course, is like, what took you so long? Of course, students aren't going to be able to read or learn properly if they're constantly distracted by their phones. So not only have we systematically failed students as we've taught them to read, or not taught them to read in some cases, we've also just designed a world that is there to constantly demand our attention. And that takes us away from those deep or reflective, sort of focus-heavy practices like reading good books. So when adults try to say why they don't read anymore, they usually cite three things. They don't have time, they can't pay attention long enough, or they blame social media. And I suspect that
Yeah, some of this is coping. Not having time, of course they have time because they're doing something as opposed to reading. They're watching television, they're scrolling through social media. So they're choosing not to allocate time towards reading. In terms of the attention aspect, yes, I would say that's a big thing. People struggle to pay attention to a page. They don't construct, I guess, a relationship with reading as being pleasurable. Maybe they were never given, well, they were never given an example of how it can become pleasurable. I mean, like I said, the curriculum tends to put books that are of no interest or no relevance. And when you habituate yourself through the education system that you associate books with irrelevant nonsense that you just need to extract tidbits of to pass tests with, of course, you're going to carry that into adult life. And paying attention to things you don't have any interest in is really, really difficult. For adults to take up reading, what they need to do is disassociate stigma from reading, even things that they have a topical interest in. So you don't have to read literature to get the ball rolling on reading. You can read crime fiction, you can read conspiracy stuff, you can read tabloids. It doesn't really matter. But once you habituate yourself into actually interacting with text in a pleasurable manner, then you can slowly replace that stuff with something a bit more substantive if you have the impetus to do so. And the focus will remain because now you've habituated your body to associate pleasure with reading. And it won't be boring. It definitely won't be boring. And at the same time, it's not something that you'll necessarily derive pleasure for every single time you engage in the activity. I mean, it's like with everything. I mean, video games get boring. Even though they're high stimulus activities, you can eventually burn out on playing that as well. And in fact, a book will seem more exciting than playing a video game because it's different. It's something else. It's exercising a different part of your mind where you're not spoon-fed elements like you are in a video game. A book requires the invocation of your own imagination, which itself is, quite fun. So there we go. As for social media distraction, yeah, well, that's on the individual because you can turn the phone to, silent mode where it's never going to ring, it's never going to buzz until you go to it.
all of these are related. The fact that we don't have time or that we can't focus is in part because of things like social media, other forms of easy entertainment are there to take up all of our time. I often like to read before bed, and occasionally I'll tell myself that I need to check my phone before I start reading. And I'll find that I end up scrolling for an hour without even realizing it. Time seems to flow differently when I'm on my phone compared to when I'm trying to do something more demanding, like reading. It's easier, it's more instantly pleasurable.
But look at the language he's using here, more demanding. I mean, you're building into the concept of reading this difficulty, this enormous roadblock, as if it's, like brain surgery. It's not, it's reading. It's just that the medium from which you're reading, you don't seem to relate to very well. Maybe for those that are addicted to screens, well, don't go off the screens. Read an ebook. You're still interacting with your device that you've habituated yourself to associate with pleasure. So you don't have to read a physical paper book. I mean, a book is an abstraction. It's a collection of text grouped by chapters and ideas that, work as a uniform aspect to present some sort of thesis or tell a story. I mean, that doesn't mean it has to be on paper.
Even though at the end of the day, I feel terrible about it. So I expect that a lot of the things that I found are true for me could be true for you or for many other people and are part of this broader explanation of why nobody reads anymore. So the result of all of this is that fewer and fewer people read books. You have your super readers who read tons of books and they keep the average numbers up. But you have more and more people who decide that reading just isn't for them. I don't know exactly what we're supposed to do about that, but that's where we are.
Okay, so that's pretty much the end of the video. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with the content that you're reading. Not everything is appropriate for everyone at every point in time in their life. When Plato was describing how education ought to be conducted in the Republic, he was saying that up until about their 30s, a man, well, I guess it would apply to women as well, because Plato was some sort of proto-feminist anyways. Equality of soul meant that men and women were equal, at least on the intellectual front. But up until the age of 30 or so, that people ought to focus on gymnastics, meaning educating themselves in relation to their body. So not intellectual activities, but gymnastics, meaning physical education. So stretching, playing sports, anything to do with physical activity. And then only when you kind of acquired a little bit of life experience were you meant to go on the philosophical path. So from the age of 30 to the age of 50 or so, you were meant to shift your interest away from the physical, from gymnastics, into philosophical discourse, because now you've lived a little bit, your body's slowing down, you're starting to get a palate for understanding a little bit deeper of what the world is all about, because you've seen a bit now. The urges of youth are starting to subside, and now you can entertain the mind. And those 20 years is where you focus on training the mind and honing that, which is completely backwards on how we have our current education system set up. And after the age of 50, you're suitable to rule. You can then engage in politics, because not only have you gained meaningful amounts of life experience, but you've also undergone the philosophical training to be able to interpret and conceptualize it appropriately. So now you're okay to join the polis, start making decisions. Now, our education system is set up based on, cramming things into your brain during your youth, exact moments of time where you could care less about that abstraction, where the gymnastics aspect is so much more interesting. That's why, everybody likes running, young kids like running around the field, kicking a ball around, or playing baseball or whatever. They don't want to sit in one place and stare at text. That's something that you want to do later on. So by forcing kids to stare at text in exactly the point in their life where they're least interested in that activity, is to build resentment towards the activity, and they will carry it as a sort of trauma into their adult life. So people don't read because they hate reading, because they've been trained to hate it by being forced to do it in exactly the point in time in their life where they had no interest in it. So that's my 2 cents. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening. Go team.